the premier University of African Scholarship. We are so glad and excited that today you have joined us to celebrate the lives, works, and times of the great John Balele Dube Umafuguzela. This lecture is on its 18th this year, and it is one of those events that the university hosts every year. And we are happy and so glad that you are all with us here to celebrate this one, the 2020 John Dube Lecture. We welcome in our midst the leadership of the university, Professor Untitled Mkhize, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the College of Humanities and Principal. And then we also welcome in our midst the deans, Dean David Spuret from the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, and Dean Thabo Mkhize, from the School of Education. And together with Professor Lebo Mulesane, who is the chair for the Dube Chair for Rural Education. We are also excited that we are welcoming this year our guest speaker, Professor Nomalanga Mkhize from the Nelson Mandela University. The respondent is our own Mr. Lukona Mnguni, who is a PhD candidate and a researcher with the Morris Webb unit here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. We are aware that we've got also guests coming from the UCCSA, the United Congregational Church, which is John Dube's church. We welcome Reverend Tin Lazi, who is the General Secretary, together with Dr. Ndebele, Kutsani Ndebele, who is the General Secretary of the Southern African part of the church. We welcome the Dube family, represented by Mr. Langa Dube and others. We are also aware that Professor Heather Hughes from Lincoln University in the UK has joined us. She is J.L. Dube's biographer, and together with Professor Cherif Keita, who made that popular documentary on J.L. Dube together with Noctella Dube. Welcome staff and students, colleagues throughout the nation. Enjoy your time with us in this lecture. As we open the lecture, we give this opportunity to the DVC and principal of the College of Humanities, Professor Untitled Mkhize, to welcome all of you to this great event. Professor Mkhize.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Professor Khumalo. Members of Council who may be present, and members of Senate, honorable ministers, the chairperson of the J.L. Dube Foundation, members of the family of Dr. John Balele Dube, members of the UCC, in particular, Reverend Ndlanzi and Dr. Ndebele, members of the executive management, deans and academic staff who are present, members of the SRC, our learners, alumni, friends of the media, members of the community of Ubaba John Dube, the community of Ohlange, our keynote speaker, Dr. Nomalanga Mkhize, Professors Hughes and Keita, distinguished guests, all protocol observed. On behalf of the Council and the Executive Management of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, it gives me great pleasure to address you on this auspicious occasion, the 2020 John Balele Dube Memorial Lecture. Dr. Dube was the founding president of the African National Congress, but he was also an educator, a philosopher, an essayist, an entrepreneur, and community builder at large. But he was also a member of the Kati royal family. He did not allow, nevertheless, his missionary education to turn his back against his own people. An astute politician, he was able to navigate the divide between the Western lifestyle and indigenous African society. He was amongst those who pioneered the establishment of African literature in isiZulu, and in this regard, not only did he found the isiZulu newspaper Ilanga laseNatali, which is still in circulation today, he also wrote novels and biographies, Insilaka Shaga or Shaga's Body Servant being one of them. But the work that was to earn him an honorary doctorate was titled Isitha Somuntu Nguye Uqobo Lwakhe. The person's worst enemy is him or herself. So, as we have attained the independence that Baba Dube worked so hard for us to attain, are we now then going to be asking ourselves the very same question? Are we our worst enemy? However, Dube's most enduring legacy was his founding of the Ohlanga High School in 1901, together with his wife, Umama Nokutela Dube, this being the first educational institution in South Africa that was founded by Black people. It should be noted that he did not rely on government or state support such as tenders to make his mark in history. Rather, the school was established through his own efforts and hard work. Ukufukuzela, as his busy lifestyle was later to be referred to. The lasting legacy is ample evidence that his efforts were not in vain, as some thought at the time. Today's lecture on the decolonization of the education system has great relevance to the life of Ubaba Dube. It is an opportunity for us to evaluate how far we have come towards the realization of the vision that was championed by Ubaba Dube and Umama Dube, namely the education of the Black child so that they can take their rightful place amongst the society of independent nations of the world. Hopefully, the lecture will assist us to reflect on the obstacles such as the greed and the continued valorization of anything and everything that is not African, that continue to bedevil our institutions and civil society at large. For our community to be properly educated and not miseducated, we need to return to some of the core values that drove Ubaba Dube and Umama Dube, such as industriousness and independence of mind. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been noted that the greatest arsenal in the hands of the colonizer is the ability to colonize the imagination of the conquered peoples. Hence, education has a great role to play in the total emancipation of both the oppressor and the oppressed. As we celebrate the 150th anniversary of Ubaba Dube's life next year, this is more important than ever, namely to reflect on these issues of our true independence. With these words, I welcome you again, and I hope you will enjoy our engagements today. I thank you.
Thank you, Kabazela, for those wonderful words of welcome, as usual. I would like also to note that we have been joined by Ms. Ella Gandhi, who is part of the audience, is with us here. I would like to note her presence and the presence of other dignitaries who've just joined us. they were all attendees and panelists really feel welcomed here today. Now, it's also important to remind you that, so that I don't forget, that when we get to the Q&A, you've got the Q&A icon there. That's what we'll be using instead of the chat. So when we get to Q&A, you'll just use what you have there as an icon instead of using the chat as we usually do. Now we have got, and Professor Fikile Mazibuko, our former DVC, who was here when we started the lecture some many years ago. It is always good to have her in our midst, so we do recognize her presence too. We are now going to get our own poet here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Ms. Ongezwa Mbele. She's gonna come forward and render an item for us. We welcome you, and over to you, Ongezwa.
Sanibonani. Ajabula ukuba lapha. Ngiyabonga ngokuthi ningimemile. We walk the race at our own pace, at the sight of racism racing us to the finish line, in a race some of us didn't choose, nitpicking on our wounds and psyche that we inherited, not by choice. I sometimes unravel of and fatigue from the relentless running, navigating for how it mapped itself in and on the landscape of my body. My resistance is not to join the race sometimes, to just bear witness to it in frozen time, to dream and imagine ourselves into being beyond what they say we are. My survival is to question and marvel at the dreams and realms that are far, but yet so near. My imagination is what is at stake as I seek for the possibility to be alive again. Violence is a distraction in our wounded relative that we want to starve, but we feed it our thoughts and being because we are at the mercy of the mirage of our hope. The winds softly whisper to me in the quiet night, saying the real plagues are the systems that deliberately flourish at the expense of our oppressions. Upupa consciously and unconsciously is a police state at times. To wrestle with knowledge and curiosity is too personal for some of us. It is ancestry work we have been called to do. Many journeys have been walked by those who came before us. May we know and remember this religiously. Memories are books of personal history. Siyagbona. Sanbonani, even to the ones you walk with that we don't see with our naked eyes. Call them your ancestors. Call them the spirits that you carry as you come undone in the becoming of you. That is beyond the self-indulgence of navel gazing. I am here to call you to actively listen to the silences and the spoken words and the in-betweens. Kuthiwa ekuqaleni wayekhona ulizwi. Ulizwi wayekuNkulunkulu. Ulizwi wayenguNkulunkulu. Yena lowo wayekhona ekuqaleni kuNkulunkulu. Konke kwavela ngaye. Ngaphandle kwakhe akuvelanga lutho kuko konke okuvelileyo. My dreams for us is for us to learn to speak again and again through the violence that are silenced, to speak what is necessary for us to live and breathe with freedom. To breathe is the most mundane revolutionary act of our time. To breathe is to give birth to history and the futures we long for, even if we don't finish the race or participate in it. If time could speak, it would say, take comfort in the discomfort okuba isazi esingazi yinde lendlela. Isikhathi sithi ukuthanda nokuthandaza nokuthandazela ulwazi lesintu as a way of being, but not a solution or the resolution or the thing that confronts the English that is in me. Ukulungisa lo mlungu ongangilungiselanga but occupied me. I'll never unknown the English language as it wrestles with the languages of being that omakhulu, otatomkhulu, obabomkhulu, no momkhulu, no dabao, no malume, no mama, no tata gave to me. Here I stand with the beings I walk with that carry me and open me to oluthando, olukhulu, olubanzi, olujulile, lwemfundiso, nokufundisa, nokufunda enhlanganisweni. Umoya uyavuma, uzavuma, uyavungusa, ndiyavuma, siyavuma. Thank you.
Wow, wow, wow. Now, as much as we celebrate technology, that it has come to our rescue, that we are still able to do our work, meet, have meetings, conferences, and services just as we do. The one area that it is depriving us of is to celebrate, is to ululate, is to make noise, is to stand up and give an ovation, and all those sorts of things that expresses how we feel. I know that if we were not doing this through this system, by now we'd all be standing on Gezwa, celebrating this great poetry that you've just given to us. So thank you, thank you, thank you so much for that. Now it is the time for us to have Professor Lebo Mlesane, who is the chair of the J.L. Dube Rural Education Program in the School of Education, who is also a co-chair of the J.L. Dube lecture, to give us the background and story of this lecture. Over to you, Professor Mlesane.
Good afternoon, everybody. As has been said, my task today is just to give you a brief, very brief overview and some history of the J.L. Dube lecture series, a research and community engagement project of the College of Humanities at UKZN. So beginning in 2003, the annual John Langalibalele Dube Memorial Lecture was hosted in the then School of Religion on the Pietermaritzburg campus. With the establishment of the John Langalibalele Dube Chair in Rural Education in 2010, of which I'm the incumbent, the School of Education and the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics have collaborated in organizing and alternating the hosting of the lecture on the Pietermaritzburg and the Edgewood campuses of UKZN. This is our first COVID-induced virtual lecture. As organizers of this lecture, my colleagues and I have the amazing support and leadership of our DVC and Head of College of Humanities, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, and our two deans, Professor Sparrett of the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, and Professor Msibi of the School of Education. Most importantly, over the years, we've had the unwavering support of the Dube family. And to all our leaders, the Dube family and our colleagues at UKZN, a big thank you. To give you a glimpse of into the history of the lecture over the past 6 years at least, I couldn't go through all of the years because it would take too long. Just a flavor for you to see who we have hosted. In 2014, we decided to focus the lecture on a woman's perspective, particularly Noctella Dube's perspective. What would she say to us today when she looks at the state of things? And that lecture was delivered by Dr. Gcina Mhlophe. In 2015, we wanted to look at one of Dube's lessons or teachings, which is African people's self-reliance and self-respect. And Dr. Duma Gandlovu presented that lecture. 2016, as you can see, we focused on the South African intellectual and political culture as enabled by John Dube's legacy. The late Professor Ndongela Masilela presented. 2017, focusing on land and its links to violence, particularly on women's bodies. And that was delivered by Dr. Maureen Tong. 2018, we focused on the promise of education as a public good by Professor Chad Berry. And last year, we focused on looking at the legacy of the liberation struggle from the pioneering generation of particularly the ANC and the PAC and so on, to the current Fallist movement. And Dr. Bongani Nqulunga presented that lecture. Tonight's lecture is titled Locating the Umbilical Cord in Africa, Why the South African Decolonization Debate Must Resist North and Latin American Academic Trends. As Professor Mkhize will outline for us, this year we locate the lecture within John Langalibalele Dube's leadership, again in self-reliance, and the need to develop our own solutions to the challenges that face us in society and our educational institutions. As once again we reflect on Dube's legacy, we ponder the question, what can we learn from the intellectual and political culture, including self-reliance and activism, enabled by John Langalibalele Dube's work to inform the current debates on decolonization and decoloniality in our higher education system. The organizing committee made up of myself and Nkonzo Mkhize from the School of Education, Sibusiso Masondo and Smangaliso Khumalo from the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, Kumbulane Mngadi and Njabulo Manyoni from the University Language and Planning and Development Office, Oli Swazulu from the Public Relations Office in the College of Humanities, we invite you to sit back and enjoy tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much for those words that make us all know what this lecture is about and where it's coming from. As you've rightfully said, this lecture is anchored by our two deans, the Dean for the School of Education, Professor Thabo Msibi, and the Dean of the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, that's Professor David Spurett. We are now going to have Professor Spurett, who's gonna introduce our guest speaker. And once he is done with that, we'll just move straight to Professor Mkhize, who is gonna give us her address. So for now, over to you, Professor Spurett.
Thank you, Professor Khumalo. Good afternoon, honored guests, including Mr. Langa Dube, representing the Dube family, Professor Heather Hughes, author of First President, A Life of John L. Dube, Reverend Thulani Ndlazi, the General Secretary of the United Congregational Church of Southern Africa, as well as Professor Sharif Kaita, Dube scholar and maker of the documentary Remembering Nokutela, as well as some other dignitaries pointed out or recognized on the list by my colleagues. Greetings also to colleagues, students and scholars and friends of UKZN. It is a pleasure and honor to introduce the J.L. Dube lecturer for 2020, Professor Nomalanga Mkhize. Professor Mkhize is head of department in the Department of History and Political Science at Nelson Mandela University. She has held academic positions at Rhodes University and roles in broadcasting and a wide range of civil organizations. Her education spans the discipline of history, where she did her master's on contestations over human remains in the Eastern Cape, and sociology, where she did her PhD on tenure reform in relation to workers on private game reserves. Her own research focuses on issues of heritage, including literature, governance, and land. In particular, she tenaciously pursues and interrogates the many facets of decolonization in relation to specific topics such as student accommodation, governance in education, journalism, and media. Her sustained attention to specificities in how colonization and apartheid shaped our human, institutional, and intellectual geography is the reason that I am so excited to hear her reflections on, to quote her subtitle today, Why the Decolonization Debate in Africa Must Resist North and Latin American Academic Trends. Among the many initiatives that she has led, one stands out in the context of the Dube lecture. That is her initiating and coordinating the Imali Today project, which sourced and published Sintu language journalism on economic topics in the Eastern Cape. I singled this out from a long and very impressive CV, I might add. I singled this out here because of something distinctive about UKZN, which is still a young institution, and that is its existential commitment to African scholarship. We declare, as colleagues have noted, that our vision is to be the premier university of African scholarship. And this is an openly decolonial ambition. One of the key forms of resistance to colonialism, apartheid, slavery, and other forms of systematic oppression is always and precisely to seek out education, to carve out and protect places for the expression of intellectual agency, and to seek to influence both the content and the conduct of inquiry. Part, but by no means all, of the enduring significance of J.L. Dube lies in his efforts and achievements in these areas, including as an educator, a founder of educational and publishing institutions, and himself a significant man of letters. It is very fitting, therefore, it's not in the least accidental, that UKZN, with its vision of African scholarship, returns regularly to Dube's example through this annual lecture. And Professor Nomalanga Mkhize is an ideal guide for this year's installment. Please join me. I know for most of us it will be in spirit rather than in fact, but nonetheless, this is the largest Zoom event I've ever been in, and I've been living on Zoom for 6.5 months. Please join me in giving an enthusiastic welcome to Professor Mkhize, who will speak to us on locating the umbilical cord in Africa, why the decolonization debate in Africa must resist North and Latin American academic trends.
Thank you, Prof. I'm very nervous about the large number of people. I'm also only used to small Zoom meetings. Unless it's a middle management forum, then it's huge. And I am sorry that it's going to be, that we are not meeting physically. I think it would, we can feed off each other better. So now talking to a screen makes me nervous. Ahead of my talk, which is quite chaotic in my own head, I will try to not make this an academic talk. I get the feeling that we are not here to get into academic minutiae. So I want to try and give a talk that underscores the importance of African-centered knowledge for the sake of building a real and credible concept of a future. But I'm going to do this in a provocative way by making some hardline arguments and doing what you should never do in academia and rejecting certain propositions just so that you can debate. Okay, so I'm going to make hardline arguments, but not because my position is necessarily really that fixed. So thank you, good afternoon to the members of the University Executive, members of the Dube family, Professor Keita, hello. Lukhona Mnguni, the respondent, the deans, and other members of this panel here, UKZN staff, students, alumni, members of the media, and everybody who is here. And especially because obviously UKZN is not only my parents' alumni, but it's also, you know, in my home province. But Eastern Cape, I want to also thank a couple of people before I start. I am timing this. I do know that I need to keep within the time. So every now and again, I might shuffle my papers just to keep time. I want to thank my parents and family, obviously. This is a very big event. So for me to be here, I know that it's because some people have raised me. I want to thank my academic community. Baba Los Pokazi, Mate, Gogo Dim, Tunzigazi, Corin, Kala, Togo, Stacy, Angelo, Darlene, Ata, Tolisa Kuzula, Londi, Makubane, Chantla, Uchena, Msindo, Maseko, Zamela, Ayanda, Hendrix, Adeshina, Salim Padat, Masibugo Chaka, Ellen Zen, Prof. Kiet, Prof. Muto, and many more that I cannot name now. A special thank you to a Black woman historian, Dr. Noma Tamsa Ngatisani, who is practically one of the few Black African women and one of the few Black historians who has been able to get into the academic world. And of course, as our history has shown, Black historians have not been kept in the academic world, and I will be talking about this. I want to thank Professor Sfiso Ndlovu, a mentor and a formidable African mind, Professor Lungsile Ntsebeza, who made a very serious person out of me, Skiba Lehwati, Jablan Sitole, as well as Professor Paul Malem, who is the reason why I took this path. I mention all these people because I think it takes a community to make one scholar, and it is in this context that I give this talk. On the 25th of May this year, a Black American man, George Floyd, died violently at the hands of members of the United States police force. Floyd's death sparked huge international outrage. In the days and weeks that followed his death, massive protests, followed by riots, engulfed the streets of some major cities in the United States. Protests also occurred in many parts of the world under the banner and slogan of Black Lives Matter. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement has been around for something of a decade and has been galvanized by both grassroots support of grassroots organizers and activists in the United States organizing against police brutality, as well as growing and steady support from Black celebrities, with the most notable being a football player named Colin Kaepernick, who knelt in protest against police killings of Black citizens in the United States. But in these current protests, there was also something else in the air, both literally as well as figuratively, and that was the coronavirus. When the protest broke out, on one hand, it was clear that many were shocked by the killing of this Black man. But on the other hand, it was clear that there was another current of discontent that at the time may not have been obvious to everybody who was witnessing these protests. What I could sense in these protests was that it was also a reaction to several other factors, including coronavirus lockdowns and the sense of helplessness and anger that people felt about this thing, this coronavirus that had happened and was wrecking our lives. These Black Lives Matter protests then served to bring people outside of their homes to see other people and to get a sense of community again. there was another undercurrent that I felt. I suspected, and I think correctly so, that within the BLM protests in the United States, I suspected that there were left-wing white kids who finally saw a platform to enact their ideologies, especially given the climate of rising unemployment in the United States, inequality, and general socio-economic malaise as we watch the US empire decline. It seemed to me that initially, even though young Black Americans had participated in initial looting and burning of shops in the initial outrage, as time went on, I speculate that many of these young Black Americans stopped. And I think there were two reasons why they stopped. The first is because in Black community, Black business owners began to point out that they were losing their business because of the looting and the burning and rioting. The second reason why I think we saw a drop in young Black American participation is that the risk of prolonged protest action for a Black American creates a situation in which they may face higher odds of being arrested while being in political protest, and the idea of being arrested as a young Black American sends you in a totally different social pipeline than if you're a white, young left-winger. And it is this interesting, I think I'm correct, okay? I did say I'm making some hardline speculations and comments. I think it is this dilemma of walking between protesting and having to retreat from protest that Black Americans, and like many other Black people in the world, have to work out for themselves. This problem of how are we to speak back to the colonial residues, the colonial systems that we still inherited, as well as still survive to live another day and build a different world. Now, because of how rapidly these protests gained traction across the world, there were many young people, even in South Africa, who took on this hashtag. It would not be the first time that they take on the hashtag, but they took it on. And yet this slogan, this slogan became a kind of popular framework for discussing any entrenched problems that Black people face. And we saw the uptake of this hashtag during the 2015-2016 student protests as well. But there was a problem with the idea of taking up this hashtag in our context. The Black Lives Matter framework, interestingly and ironically, also seems to appeal to well-educated, opinionated, international Black elites who travel the globe as the general global middle class does. Whilst they were saying Black Lives Matter on the internet, very few were willing to discuss the fact that it is, in fact, mostly the predatory elite classes of Africa that have collapsed African countries and created problems for other Black people in other African countries. And so, in fact, it becomes a shield and a mask to use the hashtag Black Lives Matter in Africa, given the nature of the problem, especially for Black elites. But of course, for Black elites, having traveled around the world, arriving in America and being positioned as somewhat non-elite, then creates this reaction of saying Black Lives Matter. But really, if we were to be honest, we must ask the question in our own countries as the Black elite, especially the Black political elite of which I am a part, are we ourselves not closer to George Floyd's murderers than closer to George Floyd, the victim himself? So this tendency to pick up global political paradigms born of struggles outside of Africa and use them as part of theorizing and formulating our intellectual content of our struggles is nothing new. We have consistently faced this challenge as Africans of attempting to formulate our struggles in relation to the struggles of others who have been oppressed like us, or in other parts of the world where people have faced their own struggles. It was this challenge that African feminists grappled with for decades. How can they articulate material, biological, political, and lived realities of African women without succumbing to the conceptual problems posed by Western feminism? Marxism, another paradigm in which African thinkers had to grapple with the conceptual relevance of this condition in terms of dealing with the question of labor in the colonies under imperialism and racialized capitalism. And also, there has been similar debate about the relevance of liberal democracy in Africa, in places especially like South Africa, well, I suppose all over the continent. This is a question Paul Kagame is asking, is being asked. Is this liberal democracy really relevant to us? It has been subject to debate. And these ideas, all born in modernity, we take them, we debate them, and we ask, are they relevant? Now, in 2015, 2016, students dropped the term transformation in South Africa in favor of the term decolonization. This they did to try and bring out a more radical and more confrontational paradigm in dealing with the problems of knowledge production in universities and also the structural problems of inequality. Now, the decolonization or the concept of decolonization is obviously not new. Apart from the political decolonization of our Pan-African struggles, there has, of course, been the question of decolonizing our knowledge, mostly popularized by Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his famous book, Decolonizing the Mind. Now, let me be upfront. Alongside this decolonization debate emerged a new term, a term I was unfamiliar with, and this term was decoloniality, or what is called decolonial studies, which seems to have taken hold of the intellectual imagination of our students, of intellectuals, of academics, and it promises to seek a way to deal with the problems of South African higher education and the resistance to transformation in South African higher education. But let me be clear. When this term emerged, I know that it was not just myself, but many others who asked, oh, what is this new term? Decolonial, is it the same as decolonization? How shall we understand this term? Once a term arrives on the academic arena, we have to grapple with it and figure out what does it mean for us. We have seen the flourishing of decolonialities of all kinds, everything from decolonial feminism to decolonial Mandela. Decoloniality rose rapidly as a favored paradigm for addressing the questions of the curriculum of knowledge decolonization. But then some of us were asking, okay, but what is particularly decolonial about Mandela? Can we have a decolonial Sisulu? Can we have a decolonial Ruth Mompati? Is there a decolonial Nomalanga? What makes this decolonial feminism different from, say, the African feminisms prior to it that had already rejected Western feminism? We have seen funding grants, professorships, all kinds of resources being thrown at this decolonial approach. It appears to really promise this path towards really unpacking the problem of colonial inheritances in South African knowledge. Now, with our students demanding this decolonial approach, wanting us to supervise them in these decolonial approaches, I could not, because I was still asking, what is it and how is it done? What is the method? I could not make head or tail of this paradigm. What is this conceptual paradigm? Or is it merely a description of activism? Now, for the parents who are in this room, I am going to just say to you, it is very key to ask these questions. When you send your child to university to do a degree and they're doing humanities, you must ask, because you are paying money. If it's not for transport, it's for a lot of things. We are called kanjalo. So I had to kind of begin to return somewhat to source and look around to see where this decolonial paradigm emerged from. And it became quite clear to me that it was being popularized largely from Latin America, where the most preeminent scholar of the paradigm being Walter Mignolo, not only, but I'm just focusing on this because I don't want this to be an academic debate, it's a provocation. So I then look, what is Walter Mignolo attempting to tell us about this decoloniality that is promising to be a paradigm in the South African context? Now, for Mignolo, it's clear that decoloniality is a response to a prior and totalizing condition of oppression that is known as coloniality. Decoloniality, he argues, as we understand it, is born out of responses to the promises of modernity and the realities of coloniality. With colonialism and coloniality came resistance and refusal. And so decoloniality is the refusal of the colonial world, the modernity of the European Enlightenment that brought us this capitalism that renders us as subjects marginal to our own economies and histories. He argued that in the ongoing colonial process and the condition, it is a form, decoloniality is a form of struggle and survival, epistemic existence based on practice and response, most especially by colonized and racialized subjects who are against the colonial matrix of power in all its dimensions and for the possibilities of an other way of thinking. It implies the recognition and undoing of hierarchical structures of race, gender, heteropatriarchy. Plus, it continue to control the life and spirituality of our lives. Decoloniality, Mignolo argues, is not actually new. Okay, that answers one of my questions. It is not a new paradigm. It is a mode of critical thought, a way, an option, a standpoint, an analytic, a project, a practice, a praxis. Decoloniality, he tells us, has a history, a story, her story. It's a practice of more than 500 years. It begins in the Americas, where we see, of course, the decimation of local peoples and this fireball of European modernity vanquishing so many of our indigenous people across the world. Mignolo thus argues the decolonial paths have one thing in common. It is the colonial wound. Now, with students clamoring to take space in this paradigm, I noticed a palpable silence from many senior Black scholars that I deeply respect. I won't name them. They were not buying into this concept. They did not openly debate it, but they did not buy into it if you spoke to them. They were not buying into this paradigm on several grounds, and they are not entirely linked only to the question of academia, but they are linked to the question of being an African today and our aspirations for our freedom. The first problem that senior, especially African historians and African sociologists that have mentored us had with this concept of decoloniality as this response to this totalizing coloniality that figures our whole spiritual life was this. The first is that decoloniality as a paradigm gives us all the words, all the English words to describe our grievance, but it cannot spell out a method for how to resolve it. We'll get to the method later. Secondly, as Mignolo states, decoloniality is actually more of a practice of dissenting. So it's a positioning against coloniality. So it's much more about the way you stand against knowledge structures and the way you position your mind in almost ready to combatively attend to the residues of coloniality. Of course, in real life, I argue, this readiness and combativeness, waiting to fight the coloniality wherever you see it, becomes a practice of focusing on coloniality itself. Put differently, you keep focusing on whiteness and its manifestations. Whether it's a clicks advert or it's your question of land dispossession, all these things now become your problem. Thirdly, because it is a dissenting posture against whiteness, it effectively imagines Blackness or Africanness as being in constant conversation with whiteness. It cannot ignore whiteness. Fourthly, because it focuses on the undoing of coloniality, it spends less time imagining the alternative, and it does not give us a good methodology for the alternative. And fifthly, and most importantly for this talk, it lacks an umbilical sense. Now, what do I mean by umbilical sense? It lacks roots in an African intellectual tradition of questioning that comes from the many spaces from which we have been derived as intellectuals, as Africans. From Gogo's lab to Utisha to Uprofessor, noma ubani umuntu omaziyo okhulisile wakhula wazi. I'm arguing that this thing I'm calling an umbilical sense is the innate knowledge, something esenkabeni, that nobody really has to say explicitly to you, but it's an intuitive sense about how to go about the world. Now, I know that decolonial scholars, now that I've accused them of many things, are going to accuse me back, but I'm going to just keep going because I'm provoking. Now, I'm going to argue that, in fact, that the decolonial paradigm as it has existed in South Africa, in particular for the past, let's say 5 or so years in its height, has produced absolutely nothing of value to Africans. And I challenge you to show me any decolonially derived text that explicitly calls itself decolonial, that has shown us a coherent alternative way of being, paradigm, or of existence that divests us from the traces of Eurocentrism. That's the challenge. And don't go and fetch something from 1980 African philosophy and say, no, but here's decoloniality. In 1980, they didn't call it decolonial. John Dube and the umbilical cord. I'm now going to put forward what I think is the real problem in South African knowledge production. And I want to argue that in general, it is a problem that the likes of John Dube and many activist converts understood as through their deep-rooted African sensibilities, as well as their European Christianity. I'm going to argue, this may sound not new, but just listen, hold on to, and listen to me. The core problem of South African education is the absence of a credible, comprehensive, and totalizing narrative of Black African history in South Africa. By this, excuse me, I'm arguing that the problem of knowledge production in South Africa derives from the absence of a foundational history of our pre-colonial story from before when whites arrived. Now, this problem is a problem that many African countries faced at the onset of independence. In the mid to late 1960s, the rest of Africa, in the universities, departments became key sites of knowledge decolonization. Much more so than any other humanities departments, history departments were tasked with decolonization. Why history departments? Because it is in history that the foundational story of the new nation state was born. Indeed, there were, of course, many debates about how to approach this. But what was important is that in African universities, African historians invested heavily in researching, reconstructing what one may call a national history that stretched thousands of years back into the pre-modern era. Many first-generation African historians were usually white professors, about Terence Ranger and the likes, but very quickly they trained Black African historians who were tasked with writing these long histories and put those Black Africans in history departments. Today, if you go to most history departments across the continent, they are staffed by Black Africans. These histories that they wrote were able to reconstruct very, very rigorous and meticulous histories of, especially beginning in what Christopher Ehret calls the African Classical Age. The African Classical Age is the same period as the medieval period in Europe up to the Renaissance period. So the likes of Toyin Falola, Berthold August, Terence Ranger, and others constructed histories of these nations that could tell complex stories of these societies going back as far as 1,500 years, okay? They've done this brilliantly in Zimbabwe, just the history of the Shona stretching, okay, from the 900 AD. And not stretching in a superficial sense, giving the dynastic histories. On the basis of these histories, African universities developed their own disciplines. The history departments provide the basis, the empirical basis, or the basis of the story, and then everybody else now has a basis upon which to philosophize, do literary scholarship, theorize sociology. In other words, the decolonization of knowledge in most African countries was thus entirely anchored in a strong and cohesive understanding of historical developments of those societies. This means that they placed African history and the reconstruction of that history at the center of their decolonization project. In South Africa, of course, sorry, let me actually just go back to this because I think I need to mention something very important. I'm so sorry about this. This kind of building is the type of building that the likes of John Dube and other educated Africans did for us. Whether Ngomkai, whether Soka, they did this task of writing African histories. And they did this because they looked around them and said, we must build institutions the kinds of institutions they built, Ohlange Institute, media such as Ilanga, which is still around today, African literatures, classics such as Nsilakashaka. And they did this guided by their umbilical sense, even if they were Christian converts. Even as Christian converts, they could see the shortcomings of colonial knowledge. That is why it is beautiful that John Dube was then given the name Umafuguzela. The implication is clear here. The task of the African educated person is not to sit, it is to build. Ukufukuza. I want to argue that ukufukuza, being indefatigable in building up African ideas, is the central method and framework of conceptual building that Africanists use. Then that even, when I say Africanists, I include the Black consciousness movement. It is building. Now, in South Africa, we have never seen a parallel emergence of Black historians, and we have never seen a comprehensive account of Black African history that encompasses all the various Black South Africans to create the story of Black Africa prior to the white man in this country. The reason this didn't happen, I'm going to quickly just say, is because obviously we've had this long period of colonization in South Africa that only ended in '94. And the white historians in university departments that did the work of history were largely focused on things like Marxist history, social history, and then 1990s heritage and memory studies and so on. With the exception, of course, of some universities, UniZulu, which tried to do Zulu histories in the clan histories. And secondly, in the 90s, UKZN was where the method of rigorous African-centered history using oral traditions was flourishing. I hope it's still flourishing there. So I would argue that, in fact, the problem in South Africa, why we see this proliferation of the decolonial paradigm, is because historians have not done their work, and because historians have largely not been able to reconstruct what I will just boldly call a national history of Black Africans in this country. There are reasons for that. Nobody wants to write a comprehensive history of Black Africans because they're going to be accused of being nativist or the rest of it. The rest of Africa has done it, by the way. Far too much of South African history of pre-colonial South African history resides in the realm of archaeology. So you don't get the rich stories that you see with Zimbabwe, where they can start 900 AD and start dealing with, you know, the Mambo dynasties. No, in South Africa, it's going to be archaeology. We have to recover those histories if we're going to provide a solid basis. I can see you, Prof. I've got my timer here. One of the problems of our pre-colonial history either being archaeology or being the history of when whites arrived in contact with us, which is the 1400s, is that we have completely erased the history of the Khoi and San clans of this nation, and we have not reconstructed their histories. As such, we see a problem then with people asking themselves, and in fact, I think we can argue that you see passing through into the rest of our political realm, where Khoisan people say, but we were dispossessed way before then. I'm looking at my time. So I'm going to argue then that the work of African historians, in fact, the work of every African academic, is to be an African historian who takes on this methodology using two methods. One is the rigorous historiographical method of locating history, and two, the method of following your umbilical instinct. The late Fatima Mia commented on John Dube and said, he respected Christianity and took all that was good from it, but he never forgot that he came from an African tradition and there was a great richness about that tradition. It was a moral tradition and a very human tradition. And he discovered that, in fact, in many respects, the African tradition was more ethical than the Christian one that he had come into contact with. Now, I want to argue that ukufukuzela is this Africanist approach and is rooted in umbilical sense of where to find our knowledge. We're almost finished. This Africanist tradition and its umbilical cord lie buried in our histories, our mythologies, our languages, in the ways in which our grandmothers and grandfathers have brought us up, in the way our communities brought us up. A few years ago, Tsepo Madlingozi did a strong I think it was about 2 years ago, he did a response to Tembeka Ngcukaitobi's book, The Land is Ours, in which he asked questions about whether African converts could really be said to have been anti-colonial in their essences. Lots of questions being posed. And I would argue that, in fact, that is not the question. Because, in fact, I'm going to tell us now and assert that we cannot escape that we are modern subjects, even us today. To ask a question of John Dube, is he colonial, is to ask a question of yourself as an educated decolonial African, if you are in any sense African. This is shown brilliantly in the work of A.C. Jordan, in Ngumbo Yeminyanya, brilliant novel. I won't tell the story, you must read it. In this novel, A.C. Jordan basically sets up a complex and brutal clash between modernity for Africans and tradition. And what is brilliant about what Jordan does here, he does not allow you off the hook. You are educated or you are not the educated. The result is chaos. And in this book, Inkonde Ungxabane, the wise man, almost represents this strong ghost of the past that keeps coming to challenge and make your life difficult as you, the modern, but very, very, you're trying your best to do your traditions and it doesn't let you go. It's a mess, this thing. But I think there are some scholars who are showing us today, as we have seen from the long tradition of African writing, through or John Dube, or Ntuli, or Jordani, we're seeing the transference of a tradition that says we know how to fukuza our umbilical sense. And so I'm going to, in closing, just name some of a few. Besides the senior African scholars, Abo Ntebeza, Abo Ndlovu, Otisani, and others who've passed this on to us, today I see a generation that is grappling with this issue of how do we locate our work in our grandmothers, in our communities, and also in challenging Marxism, in living with the clash, in Ngumbolena that clashes, and not trying to pretend that none of us are tainted by this coloniality. The first is the work of Kollega Shangu, Dr. Kollega Shange, who is doing the work on Umntwana Umakoko, and there she basically locates herself in the lineages, almost physically, having been brought up by these women and looking at the archive, meticulously going back and finding pictures, trying to understand Umntwana Umakoko. The other is Dr. Tozama April, who I think has spoken here before, perhaps I can't remember, but her work in recovering Charlotte Maxege, wafukuza uTozama waya kwi-archives to reconstruct this history of Charlotte Maxege. Abanye bazawutheorize uTozama ofukuzile. Makhosazana Xaba, similarly, in recovering the biography of Noni Jabavu, having to find bits and pieces of this woman's life. Today, people go around theorizing about Noni Jabavu thanks to her. The painstaking work of Baba Loma Kokwana in sitting with Omakulu, asking them how they understand themselves as vernacular librarians, as vernacular intellectuals. And of course, Atambile Masola, with the work of Nonsis Mgweto, a black woman, a commentator from the 1930s, similarly sitting, a Fukuzu Atambile, a Balalonto Lena, theorize getting in Vakok. Lastly, also, Uspoga Zimakadla, a Fukuza, getting the work of the women competence, the words and their stories, writing down the histories of black women who have been tortured in pain. She will write those histories, she has written them. Fukuzu Uspoga Zimakadla. So the task of our universities, in conclusion, is to teach ukufukuza, but to teach that ukufukuza as a meticulous and rigorous kind of scholarship that is going to be guided by our umbilical sense in the paths that Abo John Dube laid for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Wow, 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 wow. Wow, I don't even know where to start. Before I mess it up, well, let's have Lukhona Mnguni, one of our lecturers and researcher who is going to be responding to this marvelous, marvelous paper that has been delivered by Professor Mkhize. Over to you, Mr. Mnguni.
Thank you, Prof. Khumalo. I never want to speak when Nomalanga has spoken because she has an intellectually captivating ability that leaves you a bit paralyzed, and you need to recover and take in a bit what she has to say. And I've enjoyed that over the years of knowing her. And I think I'm where you are, Prof. Khumalo, to say, wow, and where do we start? So I will not be too long, but I will try and take out some of the lessons that are coming out of that. And I'm glad that her studying, towards the end, she goes to the problematic of the prevalence of archaeology in the study of history in South Africa, because what archaeology has also done, that focus, what it has also done is a narrative that you find in some papers that you read or books that talks about a prehistory. And I have often struggled with this concept of prehistory because it then differentiates that in the human experience, where we cannot account, we will define that as prehistory. That must be understood in a different way and at a different lens, and might not necessarily get affirmation. And that notion of prehistory sort of gives us something of like we are in the dark age, something that cannot be seen, cannot be illuminated, cannot be studied, and therefore cannot be grappled with. And therein at times we lose just that ability of the umbilical cord, and there are discontinuities then in the human experiences for those people whom some of their ancestors would fall under the era of prehistory. And once you do that, you continue at a knowledge production level, it's an intellectual level, to create this a subhumane subject that cannot be grappled with in the same sense that we can grapple with others. And I remember once asking a lecturer about this prehistory thing, and I think we nearly did have a bit of a battle because I am yet to understand, and maybe Nomalanga could make me understand better as to what is the place of prehistory in our studies particularly. But I think today's takeaway, particularly to us young academics who are still being chiseled and really being brought up into the tradition of academia, is to continue this work of ukufukuza, be all over trying to mine out the buried narratives, mine out the buried histories, and just the buried, as she said, the historiography of things as to what happened, how it happened. And once that information is on top of the table, then other people can theorize. To me, what that says is that we have such a backlog in our scholarship, that our scholarship has a deficit in it, and therefore the people we produce out in terms of our university graduates and so on, they are going to be embodiments of that scholarship with a deficit. And therefore they might not be so well placed to serve society in a correct way, because we must always come back to the necessary question as to why does the institution called a university exist? What does it seek to impact? What does it seek to achieve? Particularly one such as the University of KwaZulu-Natal, that prides itself as wanting to become the premier university of African scholarship. What does that mean? What does it mean in terms of how it structures itself, organizes itself, and focuses on certain thematic areas of knowledge production, if it indeed is going to emerge as a premier university of African scholarship? And of course, this idea of us reminded that we are modern subjects ourselves, and therefore we might not ask of others whether they were, in the true sense of the word, really decolonization sort of agitators. And I think this is important, but it also brings to my mind something that's also important to us, is to ask the question, are there irretrievable losses owing to colonization that we must be aware of? Are there things that happened that we cannot undo, so that we do not waste our time? As she's saying, the issue of decoloniality seems that it cannot, and I made a note here, it cannot ignore whiteness at all. And how do we make sure that we divide our labor, we divide our time in such a way that we do not spend too much time gazing backwards with the wrong lens, which is not going to help us to move forward. And I think that the two methods that she leaves us with, that of the umbilical instinct. Now, funny enough, this happens at a time I'm home in my village where my umbilical cord fell in Kabayam. And I want to sort of zoom into this concept of Inkaba, because at times Inkabayako can fall at a home that is not regarded as your home. And other rituals have to be performed as you grow to really give you a sense of home and a sense of belonging. So while this umbilical instinct is important, is it possible that in our understanding or trying to understand the spiritual makeup of the African people, we might also want to grapple with the question of, is our umbilical cord, Inkaba yetu, did it fall at the right place? Or do we still need to perform certain rituals to rediscover the real sense of home, the real sense of being? Because in the African sense, at least, if you do not have a sense of home where you ordinarily go back to, you then have a sense of displacement, and your being itself is affected, because then you are grappling with the questions of your identity. And that's why we see it at times, old people in their 60s even changing their surnames, because where their umbilical cords fail, they do not find a sense of home, a sense of belonging. And therefore, what is the dilemma in this umbilical instinct that we talk about? Is it a manufactured instinct because of allegiance to the place that we call home? Or is it an instinct that is so innate that even if your umbilical cord is at the wrong place, you will still, within that innate instinct, find your way, and it will act as a compass of discovery of your being? And this question of discovery of being poses an important question for African scholars, because it then means that they need to deviate from certain academic foundations that are already there, which are channeling us to research in a particular way, to publish in a particular way, and effectively to become certain academics. Are we trying to identify and define a new way of doing academia? And are we modeling our school or our universities in a way that will allow this critical mass, this praxis at least, to come up and germinate the seeds of moving forward, and germinate the seeds of taking African scholarship and African history, particularly as Prof. Mkhize puts it so well, that one of the core problems is just this absence of a comprehensive history, a foundational history of Africa, pre-colonial, particularly within the South African context. And she touches on it and quickly leaves, because she says some people have a fear of even conducting this history, and their fear is mainly political and not academic. What happens when in our society we've allowed politics and sentiment to take such prominence in a way that it displaces the focus that is needed from academics, in a way that it becomes molding to the focus of academic work? Doesn't that paralyze our society? And therefore, one of the questions I would pose to her is that how do we push back on the politics of sentiment, which would say you are studying tribes, which would say you are talking about tribalism, which would say you in a rainbow nation, you are fueling division and all of that? Because that's so important, that point you were touching on but didn't stay on. It's such an important point because it has defined some academics' trajectory in the sphere of knowledge production, and it has dumbed down our pursuit for this African history you talk us through. And it has also limited us in terms of our expression, in terms of finding our own expression in the knowledge production, which takes us to questions about new publications. If you talk about new journals, how different are those journals to the existing journals? Or is it mainly an act of making more space for people to publish, but nothing has been disrupted in the sense of the content, in the sense of the expression, in the sense of the phenomenon that is being studied and being given prominence. So I think you have really provoked us to think scientifically on certain questions and paradigms that we need to focus on in terms of going forward. Because what you say from Walter Mignolo's disposition in terms of decoloniality, it is important, that place where he talks about how the modernity out of the European world has become so controlling of our lives and our spiritual lives. And I think that's what Ali Mazrui had in mind as well in the late 1970s, probably, when he was calling for the indigenization of the African university, which you may say that has now graduated to the decolonization of the African university. But there's always been this yearning for a different existence, because our existential reality is such that we feel this burden of a totalizing Eurocentric experience in the corridors of academia and in the corridors of knowledge production. And I call it a totalizing burden because we know who we are, but we can't be who we are because we are not where we exist. We are not where our umbilical cord fell. We are in a borrowed space that we must call home, and that is academia. And I suppose, how do we transform this landscape of academia to a space where we can feel that we belong, and that indeed Inkaba Yethu is at that place, and we can find a way to actually exist and create this, what some people from that decoloniality school call epistemic disobedience. Is there space for epistemic disobedience that cannot be punished? Is there space for epistemic disobedience that will still get you a degree that is comparable and acceptable to a European university? Or if we do epistemic disobedience in such a way that it displaces us from the actual university space, there would be no upward mobility for those that commit that so-called transgression. So the point I'm trying to raise is whether or not we need to be creating epistemic disobedience. Is it even that? Or is it really about us finding new ways to go about? And it's clear, Unomalanga starts off very well because she almost like Ushi Tagazelo Zagubo, calling these academics that have influenced her. And of course, we recite our clan names to remember the great forebears that came before us and took the torch to lead our families and build our families and create names for our families. So I felt that your starting point was really that recitation of academics who have been forebears on this path of discovery, on this path of history making. But what is the problem of having so few who have probably made that impact? And as you say, it's not just only for the history academics, it is for all academics who are African, whether they're in anthropology, whether they're in religion, because even there in religion, RPC, we deal with questions of Black theology, Black liberation theology, because of African religion, because of this totalizing experience of colonialism that has only, well, ended in 1994 in legislation, but probably in practice continues to be present amongst us here in South Africa. So I think we are probably even talking not about ukufukuzela. As you say, Dube built a school. Perhaps is the challenge to us, not that we need to build a university that's going to allow us to do these things that we are doing. Because for how long must we fight for this transformation within universities that are resisting to transform, within universities that are unwilling to transform because they are also caretakers of a particular heritage, because they are institutions born out of a particular history and a particular time. So I wonder if ukufukuzela kwethu is to such a point that we need to start collecting bricks, we need to start collecting cement and water so that we can build institutions that allow us to be, that we do not have to fight so hard to exist, to be recognized, to be acknowledged, and to be affirmed. A space that will truly be a space that liberates our history and archives it and theorizes it and gives it the conceptual dimensions so that in terms of the epistemological design of our faculties, of our disciplines, we are able to infuse from a standpoint of knowing, from a standpoint of affirmation, and from a standpoint of what I always say research is about, a standpoint of truth, because academia must reflect truth. And if we acknowledge that there is a deficit in the current scholarship today and that there has been a failure in the history departments of universities in South Africa, then we are admitting that our universities have not served our society in enacting the truth about who we are as a society. Thank you very much, Prof.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you also, Lukhona. I have a sense, I don't know how other colleagues feel. I think the combination of Professor Mkhize and Lukhona Mnguni is very, very dangerous for the mind in one session. You need more than one session to take in most of what they have to share and push. We really have had a treat this afternoon. So thank you so much to both our speakers. They've been on their elements, and we celebrate your contribution. You've educated us. You've reminded us of Dube and his colleagues. You've reminded us of the importance of our histories and identities written by ourselves, telling our own stories, digging from our own reservoirs of knowledge. Those old people who still have the knowledge. What we're going to do now is time for question and answer from people, and also the responses from our colleagues. Of course, we are challenged in terms of time. I can see we've got over 22 questions in our Q&A tool there. And also we are still going to be taking some that people are going to be raising their hands and asking. So we might not take all of them, but we are going to make sure that when we get to that, we give you enough time. But before that, we are going to, okay, after that, we will then have the Dube family coming forward to say thank you. But for now, let's go straight to the question and answer session. We're going to take the first three questions from our Q&A portal here. I'm not sure if you can see them, Professor Mkhize, just the first three, if you can respond to that, and then we will move to check on the hands. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first question says, isn't it that decoloniality has produced something in making people aware of decoloniality as a concept? No, that's self-referential. Me making you aware of something is not the same thing as doing something academically constructive with it. I'm arguing that the paradigm is not generating, it does cause us to have to stop and keep criticizing the colonial knowledges, but does not take us further to then generate the alternatives. And for me, I'm arguing that this is I mean, perhaps I couldn't say because I have to also watch for time here, but it's by and large, by the way, because these are academics who write about these things. And for their scholarship, they don't have to provide an alternative. They can just produce a critique. Now, a critique is okay, but one of the other things I noted about the decolonial scholarship of late is that it does largely come from white Latin Americans. Now, if you know something about Latin America, you'll know that the indigenous people are nowhere near the hierarchies of the class hierarchies at the top of the class hierarchies. They are those who are you know, obliterated by the colonial encounter, in fact. So I find that Latin American elite academics can sit and have the privilege of being able to critique something that they don't actually need to find an answer for, because their personal lives don't actually get affected in the way that others do. So that's the first one. I have to, the role of young people in the journey of Ukufukuzela. So the issue here is resistance is one thing, Ukufukuzela is another. To resist, nokufukuzela, in this context I'm talking, are two different things. To resist is to fight. Ukufukuzela is to build. And those are two totally different things that we need to impart. Building a school is not the same thing as joining the armed struggle. Now, joining the armed struggle is imperative for our liberation, or going out there and fighting. Those things are almost non-negotiable for Black life. Those are normal in Black life. The question is, what kind of pedagogies are our institutions passing on? So there's the critical pedagogies of resistance, and then there ought to be the critical pedagogy of ukufukuzela. Ukuze ungafika e-university uthi uzohlala la wazi wena ukuthi nje uzoshaya ama-shutdown, uzosebenza nini ngoba use-university? Because there's a whole family, there's a whole community, there's a whole people whose material life is dependent on how this university goes for you. But of course, we know that half of the problem is we have a whole structural basis of our economy, which is struggling to absorb Black people, especially young Black people. So now academics cannot afford to simply criticize the white system. We are going to have to, as Black people, find some of the remedies that make sense in order for us to be able to live. This goes back to my prior comment, my earlier comment in the talk, where I said, Black American young people withdrew somewhat from these protests at the point at which I think it became clear to them that they had to make a choice between continuing to protest and possibly facing life in jail, which is different for Black Americans, or they could protest a bit and then withdraw and go back into their communities and reorganize themselves however they wish. The people who have the privilege in this instance in the US, if you are looking at it, are largely white suburban kids. The Black kids have to go home because life will not stop. And so one of the things, and this intergenerational paradigm is very important. You may be young at university, you will not be young 20 years after that. If you do not get it that at some level, the responsibility of every elder Black person as you reach that age is to sustain the younger ones after you. You will struggle then, I think, because that is the hardship of Black life. So those were, I'm losing the questions. They seem to have gone upside down. So those were the first three that I saw.
Yes.
I've missed them, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, it's Marxism. Yeah, if you can do that.
Marxism and ideal system.
Yeah.
So again, my point about raising the problem of modernity is that, look, people like Amilcar Cabral kind of reconciled this thing of being Marxist and being Africanist. Achima Feja, similarly, Marxist, Africanist. Bernard Makubane as well to some extent, although I think he was much more of a pure Marxist, that guy, Makubane. But the issue is you have to be able to look at Marxism, and then if your umbilical sense, this thing that is difficult for me to describe, says, listen to that thing and start interrogating why you feel that like a theoretical framework like Marxism may not entirely make sense in our context. Now then the work after that, you use your gut instinct to tell you something is a mismatch here. This is the same gut instinct that students use when they walk into classrooms and some professor is talking about Ubuntu, and the Black students are like, but do you even know what Ubuntu is? That's their umbilical sense reacting there. Now, it's all good and well to then go and say, yeah, when a professor obas Ubuntu, or you can sit down and begin to formulate the conception, which is the work that of Africans. That is my point has been that there has never been a generation of Africans that can get away from doing the labor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Prof. I don't see. Yeah, just keep going on them because I don't see any hand. Yeah.
Okay, so archaeology okay. So archaeology is a very important science, if you can call it a science. It's a very important method for historians. Part of the problem, so in Zimbabwe, they've managed to basically history and archaeology are usually in the same department, and they've trained up basically African archaeologists who have a strong conception of African history. So in Zimbabwe, which is my point about how other African countries did it, they were able to then get that archaeology to take up the oral history paradigms. So in other African countries, there's none of this like silence and Stone Age silence that we tend to see in South Africa. Having said that, outside of the universities, the histories are there. So all our clan lineages, all our oral histories, all the different traditions are there that actually tell us these 1,000 and so forth old histories. The problem is now having to reconstruct them and finding frameworks to reconstruct these histories, but most importantly, to then try and put them together so that when the next generation of African children or any child in this country should be able to have a cohesive sense of life of Africans from Limpopo down to Elsa's Rivier, and have a cohesive understanding of that history and not a fragmented history. So Ulukanyo made the point about, people accuse us of tribalism. You can sense that part of the colonial inheritance in South Africa, the apartheid inheritance in particular, has been the inability for us to come and make this synthesized history. So I will know histories of certain, so I'll know Xhosa history deeply. It's a long history on its own, but I may not know history of Abavenda as deeply. People in KZN will know deeply history of Amazulu, as well as know their own clan history deeply. But you try and connect that to other clans in other regions, other Africans. That's the work that has to be done.
Go ahead, Prof. Let's meet them, yeah.
Okay, there was a question for Lukhona. How do you explain a student who does not know himself 4 generations backwards? Let me just deal with this. So, because as Lukhona points out, and this is the distinction of South Africa than many other African countries, is that we do have a real internal colonial legacy here. That internal colonial legacy does not divest us of being Africans. It's very important to say that, because there's a tendency both in South Africa and also, by the way, outside of South Africa, for fellow Africans to look at South Africa as though it's not a country of Africans. And yet, when we're sitting down together, we all understand each other somehow. We seem to have this, as Sheikh Diop says, cultural continuity somehow exists. The problem with South Africa is much more that we were colonized first. 200 years before anyone else was colonized, South Africa was colonized. So there is a deep-seated dispositional problem in South Africa. So there is a lot of dislocation in South Africa. Now, the argument I'm making is you can sit and take a decolonial approach to that if you want. I don't think you're going to find anything. Better for me is better if you say, look, where is my umbilical cord? Why do I feel umbilically displaced? And how can I find a sense of umbilical ease, even though I don't know where my umbilical cord lies, which is many South Africans? For me, that question is much more productive because you're now working within your cultural frameworks. There's nothing wrong with cultural frameworks. We are nobody outside of what other people have taught us. So the idea when we're dealing with African questions, you are being cultural. Well, who isn't being cultural? When Marxists were dealing with the Romanovs or, whoever, the various Tsarist dynasties, that was their culture. They were dealing with their culture. When Germans write German sociology, they don't take examples from South Africa when they were writing. They were taking examples from their context and saying, we're trying to make sense of this. There is no academic writing that is without cultural paradigm. That is why we have a problem with Western feminism. Because every time we look at it and we say, but that doesn't make sense where I come from. But as soon as Africans say, use your cultural intelligence to unpack the questions, you're told you are being a cultural nativist. Now, one of the ways that I pose this question, very quickly, Prof. Smangalis, is this. Yes. I say to students, we have inherited a academic paradigm that says people are socially constructed, certain elements of human culture are social constructions. Then I asked a very simple question. Is Thakazelo a social construction? If you use the concept of social construction, can you then take Thakazelo as a ritual naming and call it a social construction? Or do you need a different concept for that? Now, you can only ask that question if you use your umbilical sense. You almost can't ask that question if you're You can be a brilliant white academic who sits in the archives, I'm happy for you. But you almost don't know how to ask the very basic question, just social construction. Am I socially constructed as ukhabazel? Is that a social construction? No, my yin. And that led me to very different questions. Like, no, it's an ontological naming. It's an ontological construction. In some ways it is a construction, but it's ontological. So when I am called the parts of me which respond are the parts of me that understand. I don't know how to describe that. It's an umbilical sense. I don't know how to describe it. So these things have very huge implications for how our histories come to be written. So when academic historians are writing Marxist history and all of that, and they start to divorce Africans from the ways in which their environments and cultures have given them concepts and paradigms, that's why you get this difficulty then in the academic world. I don't know if there's another question. Do you think that most young Africans it has been compromised, the umbilical instinct? Yes, I think it has been, but, and I think, let me say how I think, and I think it's a much more generational issue. I know all Black people are not the same. I know we don't all come from the same homes. We're not all African in the sense that I am, having come from a rural area. People come from different parts of, so we're all elements of environment are different. But there has been a huge problem in the South African education system in its resistance in dealing with a coherent history. It does not transfer cohesive historical memory to young South Africans. So the de facto paradigm then is a decolonial paradigm, which is all you can do is fight with the white knowledge, because your education system does not transfer long historical consciousness to you. So the only thing you can play with is what whites did to you. You can't go and argue about some other thing. You can't argue about other things because you have to argue only with what you know, which is what did whites do, because our history really just tells us about our fights with white people, even when we are talking about an African perspective. So the South African education system itself lacks this historiography that I'm talking about. You won't see that in Ghana. You won't see that in most African countries. You won't see it. I saw the Ghanaian history curriculum for school asking things like, how did our ancestors live, so and so? And I thought to myself, in South Africa, you could never ask the question like that. You could never say, how did the ancestors, you could never say that. And so the historical memory of South Africans, young South Africans, and by the way, if I can just put it like this, you could see it manifest in the Fallist movement in the way that so students rightly approach these things confrontationally. They take decoloniality as one of their strong approaches. When the student movement ended, suddenly decoloniality was struggling to generate. But where has decoloniality gone now? It has become almost the terrain of white women academics. Now, anything they do in a classroom is decolonial. Anything, you can just attach. I do decolonial teaching of my working class students. You don't need decolonial. What are you doing that is so decolonial? People are getting major grants saying they're going to do epistemic disobedience. Can't one is epistemic disobedience? How is it epistemically disobedient if it doesn't look like what my grandmother taught me? And these big words, this jargon keeps coming through. But you don't get the sense that anybody has really recreated that sense of historical consciousness that ties, especially a young mind, to many intellectual traditions that have come before them. In the way that I was saying, you must look for her work. Kolega Shange does with msebenzi wakhe Mntwana uMagogo.
Let me give this opportunity to Lukhona to come and weigh in your closing remarks, and then after that we will have Mr. Dube Ulanga Balele to speak on behalf of the family.
No, thank you, Prof, and thank you, Prof. Mkhize. I really, get the sense that we need different types of institutions if this work is going to really gain traction, because one of the things that is interesting and fascinating is that when a Prof. Mkhize, if you're trying to meet a class halfway in the South African context, it's very difficult. Because if you say, and I think you once said this some years ago, if you stand up in a class and say, recite your clan names, there's a part of the class you are talking to, there's a part of the class you are not talking to. Because there's a part that has clan names, there's a part that doesn't have clan names. And there's questions you say, for example, in the Ghanaian curriculum, and why they might not be able to come here. And I think really this then becomes about representation of beings and which beings matter more than the others, because there's definitely almost no midway point, and there's inclination towards this westernized and really downplayed African history part of it. And really, this is why I'm saying maybe we need a different type of institutions, or really push hard for institutions. And there's a question there, Prof. Khumalo, that I was asking about religion, you know, and especially Christianity and what role it plays in our studies in terms of being programmed, you know, into this, because the religion itself has institutions, has rituals, and has do's and don'ts. So your moral standard, what you deem acceptable and not acceptable. And this is why some people now, they don't go back to their home if there's going to be a cow slaughtered, because their religion does not allow them to do something like that. And this creates what I often call a spiritual dystopia even further, because we find ourselves in this multifaceted existence in different institutions where we are expected to behave differently and within different norms. And therefore there is no normativity that is truly African and accepting of the African way of life. And therefore the African being lives this spiritual dystopia, or a form of life that poses various dilemmas in their approach to existence. And so you're always searching for some trueness about who you are and really where you come from. And then you end up denouncing some of the things that make you who you are, because in the institutions where you usually find yourself, they are denounced as, you know, barbaric, uncivilized, backwards, and all of that. So it's really, I think, about also finding new institutions. And I think for me, that is the takeaway in terms of how do we move this forward? It's not just about asking the right questions, but it's also saying, can those right questions truly exist within these institutions that we find ourselves? And I definitely think that the question of how do you orient new institutions, because it's not just about new institutions, not just about buildings and then saying this is a new institution, but it talks about the people whom you have in that institution and how do you ensure that you build a critical mass. And then again, that places the burden on a lot of African scholars who are already burdened by many things: demands to research, demands to teach, demands to mentor, and demands to just be informal parents, in actual fact, in the university setting, which there is a great deal of that, where students just walk into your office because they feel comfortable with you, and you are in the minority in some departments, and they really just want a parent figure out of the academic, and the academic is taken away from their work. And so these are the existential questions I think we need to ask, if we locate ukufukuzela within the institution of academia, and what it really means, and how do you liberate the potential of ukufukuzela of African academics, and what things do we need to place in our institutions as support systems and support mechanisms. Because if the institution is unaware of the burden that is being carried by the African academic is never going to have space of ukufukuzela, because you then need to insulate them as much as you can from all those demands that are banging on their door, precisely because they are African and only in a minority, and so much is placed on them. Even a CV, students will come, that's time, that's focus. And these are the realities that I think we need a critical mass of African academics to really speak out, because without speaking out, the system is not going to change, because nobody knows. You die inside. That money you spend on groceries for students who do not have, while you are also not taking much home, by the way, because you're not getting equal pay for equal work with your other white counterparts in the very same institution. So these are the things that I think are coming out for me in terms of building the institution that's going to allow this work to flourish and happen. Thank you very much.
Prof. Mkhize, do you want to make your closing statements?
Well, look, thank you for letting me talk and put this out there. I do think we are facing a bit of a distraction if we are focusing on theories that just make us focus on the colonial problem, when in fact it will always be a problem. I want to say to Lukhona, it is precisely meticulousness and rigor that has been stripped away from our academic world. We have been stripped out of putting the rigor into the African work that we have to do, and being put into a factory-like conditions where we find ourselves being counselors, overloaded teachers. We cannot think under these conditions. And that leads me to the point that the Black and African executives in our university, you are dropping the ball. You have got to stop flowing with this corporatization that crushes young African academics, and you expect them to wake up, teach, counsel, Black African executives of all kinds, stop the corporatization paradigm. Asifuna ukufukuza ama students, sifuna ukufukuza umsebenzi wama Africa. And until our executives admit that they have fallen into this trap of basically not transforming universities, but turning them into quasi-factories, including challenging, by the way, our minister Ublade. You are a Marxist. You cannot sit there and tell us that you understand these institutions to be transformed when in fact they are entirely constructed on Fordist lines of labor. Sifuna ukufukuzela ama-Africa, not ukufukuzela lento esiyenzayo le ufukuzo ngayindawo.
Thank you so much, Professor Nomalanga. I actually find some element of consolation being at UKZN, because there is a project that the DVC of the College of Humanities and Principal Ubaba Zela, he's got a project that he doesn't talk a lot about, but he's got an archival project that is going on in his school that he sponsors from his own resources, that goes back, digging up African sources of knowledge and African epistemology and all that. And not much is known about that project. Even religion goes there. You go there, you find lots of material on African forms of religion and spirituality that has not been made popular today. So that is a consolation on its own. As you rightfully said, Prof. Mkhize, we still have the oral history project at the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics. Of course, it's floundering as a result of lack of funding and all that. Just that part that Professor Denise was running of digging up history orally, going out to communities and talking to people when we are doing our own history. There is that project that we used to have, but it is limping along. And today, I think these two projects should be at UKZN should become very much important flagship projects that build history. In fact, in our school in Pietermaritzburg, just the Department of History in Pietermaritzburg is actually struggling for some time in terms of staff and all that since Aboba Bustol and others left. It's been struggling. Just the history itself is one of those that has been left behind. So you've challenged us to look at that as this institution, to value those resources. I'm now going to ask Ubaba, Dube, Ulanga, Balele to come forward and speak on behalf of the Dube family. And soon after him, Professor Msibi is gonna give a vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, let me start by first thanking Professor Nomalanga for those valuable and insightful information. And again, to all the participants, Lukona Mguni as well, and other panelists. On behalf of the Dube family, let me just say that we would like to thank each and every one of you, for keeping my grandfather's, legacy alive, and also sharing such valuable information. It's such a wish that at some point, it's a pity that was still in the whole entire country was still engulfed, by this coronavirus. But at a certain point, I think I did raise this to you, Professor Kumalo, to say
Yes.
we needed to take such, conversations, to where the communities are, so that our people can also make those valuable contributions, so that they begin to know, particularly our youth, because most of them, they still remain in the dark, in as much as some of them are quite keen and have the capacity and the ability to become historians and be in charge of our country. If you look at the history we're coming from, it was well articulated by Professor Nomalanga Mkhize to say really, and we're not actually being honest to ourselves, because what she was actually touching on, there's a lot of ancestral connections into all what JL stood for, and the whole entire umbilical cord, if we were to really place it and take it to its rightful place. Indeed, at a certain point, it's my wish to you, Prof, and other contributors into such conversations, for us to make an effort so that we take it to the local townships, to our rural communities, so that people begin to understand and really place their identity and begin to know who they are, where are they coming from. With those words, I would like to thank one and all, and Prof, to you particular, Tungwa, keep on the good work in preaching this good work of keeping our grandfather's legacy alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mbuyas. Let us have Baba Msidi. Can you come forward, Professor Msidi?
Thank you very much, Professor Kumalo. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to greet the Deputy Vice Chancellor and the head of the college, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize. Fellow deans were here present, Professor Sparrett, and I note that Professor Ojong, the Dean for Social Sciences, is also present with us today. Senior Director in Student Services, Professor Mazibuko. Members of the Dube family, represented by Mr. Langa Dube, our profound and amazing guest speaker for today, Professor Nomalanga Mkhize. Our respondent, Mr. Lukona Mguni, was also incredible today. The planning team for this JL Dube lecture, UKZN students, alumni, as well as Professor Hughes and Keita, Dr. Gandhi. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. My task is fairly simple this afternoon, is to just convey our appreciation and gratitude for your participation and attendance today. I've been attending these lectures for the last 8 years. And each year, I keep on saying this was the best lecture by far. But I must say today, it wasn't one of the best. Not only because it was thought-provocative, but because we also got a bit of a hiding as higher education managers for the for continuing with the and I think we need to sort of deeply reflect upon what Professor Mkhize has shared with us today. I think that this was highly thought-provocative, in part because we're being asked to do something greater than what we've been doing before, which is Ogufuguzela. You know, at some point, Prof. Mkhize, I wanted to ululate on this side of of the computer, because I think we've gotten and into the language of fighting continuously without actually thinking deeply about what it may mean to build new institutions and to build new knowledge that you were talking about, or knowledge, actually not new knowledge, knowledge that was existing but got erased. And I think part of the complexity is also navigating the space in which South Africa finds itself in, where even a child will have the basics of who they are, their umbilical cord, go into a school, and at the process of going into a school, have to assimilate into a new culture, a new order that tries to undo every single thing that they've learned. And so this deep request that comes from your presentation today, to think through about what we've been doing in academia, particularly also in education, because I come from the School of Education as Dean. We need to start thinking deeply about that history project. How do we go back and unearth this knowledge that has been lost and in fact erased through the various epistemicides that we've seen through the centuries? So this was incredible. It was amazing. I want to thank you, Prof, for really pushing us in this presentation and for getting us to think about also how we take on new concepts and how we use such concepts that may actually just come in today and tomorrow they're gone. And sorry, Prof. Khumalo, you'll excuse me because this, you know, this topic is very close to my so as Prof. Khumalo was talking, it really resonated with me also about how we're participating in a deep colonizing project, which is utilizing the notions of decoloniality, decolonization, as if we are doing the project of decolonizing and decoloniality, but in fact, we are actually just reinforcing the project of colonialism. And the fact that the people who are speaking the language of decoloniality at present are in fact white academics, white women academics who do not have any interest in this project. I mean, you know, you are spot on, and this is it. And part of me also has been wondering whether, in fact, a project of decolonization can actually happen in the current mode and structure of higher education today. I don't think it can. I don't actually think we can we can use these institutions that exist today, which is an argument that Lukona was making. To do this project, it really requires a new type of imagination. So let me just stop there before I go on and say how beautiful and powerful your speech was today. It really was amazing. And Lukona, your response was actually also spot on in relation to going back and tracing, which and going there and engaging with the process of finding the self. And I think we've lost that project as we engage with education and with higher education. I want to really, really thank you both for insightful, thoughtful, provocative engagements today. Our poet, Onge Zambele, many of you would not know, the first trip I did overseas was with Ongezo. And it was the first time actually hearing and seeing her doing a poetic rendition. That was powerful. And I still, and I know Professor Mkhize, don't get upset if I'm using this concept of we can't breathe, but this idea that Ongezo was talking about, that breathing itself is a revolutionary act. I mean, I think it really touched, it went to the heart and the soul of the presentations actually that we've seen today. I want to thank Reverend Lanzi from the United Congregation Church of Southern Africa for the continued support that they've provided to this lecture. The Dube family always being present in this lecture and always really offering powerful insight, powerful information that we can use in advancing Dube's profound work. I want to thank the university and college leadership for the support, particularly corporate relations, who've organized the session and made sure that it happened in a very professional and organized manner. I want to thank your team, Oliswa, for the incredible work that they've put in. I also want to convey our gratitude to our international guests who attended today, members of the media who attended today, and of course, everybody who participated in today's session. I would be remiss if I did not convey my gratitude to the planning team for the incredibly hard work that they've put in organizing this virtual talk. Colleagues, I know that it has been a very, very difficult planning period to make sure that this lecture actually happens in the context of COVID, the first lecture ever to be done virtually. I think you've done a profound job. You found an incredible speaker and an incredible respondent, and I think that we've all benefited from this lecture. Well done, colleagues. I want to wish you well, everybody, as you go and enjoy your meal. At this stage, I would say please let's go and have something to drink and nibble on. But unfortunately, we have to do it virtually. So please, in your own spaces, enjoy your evening and have a glass of wine for all of us. Thank you so much, colleagues.